racist cop thought he could manipulate the law to frame a black woman. But this time, things didn't go as planned. In just a split second, he realized he had made a grave mistake. The courthouse stood proudly in the heart of Charlotte, a gleaming stone edifice with towering columns that whispered of power and law. Every morning, the crowds poured in. Lawyers in sharp suits, clerks clutching stacks of files taller than their heads, families carrying either hope or the heavy weight of fear before the inevitable. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of old wood and printer ink, a constant reminder of the fates that had been forever changed behind those doors. This was the place of justice, of order, a place where futures were shaped. But today, justice was being suffocated under the weight of prejudice, and inside, the air felt thick with a different kind of tension. Judge Samantha Hayes had walked these halls for years. The sound of her heels echoed off the stone floor, her stride confident, unhesitant. A sharp, determined woman, she had climbed a mountain most wouldn't dare attempt. Born and raised in Riverdale, Chicago, Samantha knew what it was to struggle, to carry the burden of having to prove herself 10 times over just to be seen as worthy. She had fought for the position she held today, building her reputation. Case by case, trial by trial. Each scar was a reminder of what she had overcome. At 45, Samantha commanded her courtroom with an aura that required no raised voice to be heard. Her black robe draped over her frame, her natural curls neatly pinned back. Every decision she made was deliberate, measured. The weight of the gavel in her hand had never been something she took lightly. She knew the power she held. She knew the eyes waiting for her to make a mistake. But power was a strange thing. For some, a black woman on the bench was a symbol of progress. For others, it was an affront, something that needed to be fixed. And no one embodied that hatred more than Officer James Foster. James Foster had patrolled the streets of Charlotte for over 20 years. His uniform was always crisp, his badge gleaming with an almost blinding shine. He took pride in his work, in the order he maintained. To him, respect wasn't given, it had to be earned. And he had earned it, time and again, ensuring that anyone who came into his line of sight knew exactly where they stood. Foster believed in the law, but only when it served the right people. At 51, with a square jaw and piercing blue eyes, he carried himself with the kind of confidence that only those who had always been protected, always had the system behind them, could possess. He had never feared consequences, because he had never truly faced them. His record wasn't spotless, but it was clean enough. Complaints had been filed but swiftly dismissed. Those who dared to speak out had been silenced, with threats, bureaucratic dead ends, and the simple truth that no one wanted to be the one to bring him down. So he moved through life untouched, unchallenged. Until today. The courthouse lobby was a sea of people. Lawyers weaved through the crowd. Security staff scanned faces as each person entered. Samantha pushed open the front doors, one hand holding her briefcase, the other scrolling through her phone. She had reviewed the cases for today, her mind ready for the upcoming hearings. At first, she didn't even notice Foster. He was standing near the security checkpoint, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the room like a predator surveying its territory. He saw her before she saw him. And there was something in his expression that darkened, just for a moment. Samantha had never directly confronted him, but she knew the type of man he was. She had handled enough cases involving officers like him, men who thought their badge gave them absolute power. Men who saw her as an obstacle rather than an ally. She had ruled against officers like him before. She had seen their faces twist in anger when they realized she was the final word, the power they couldn't ignore. As she approached the security checkpoint, their eyes met. Foster stepped forward, his tone dripping with disrespect. "Ma'am, you need to go through the metal detector." Samantha glanced at him, then at the metal detector. She had passed through this door every day for years. Judges were exempt from security checks. It was a privilege, a recognition of their position. Every officer in this courthouse knew that. She raised an eyebrow. "I don't need to go through security." Foster didn't budge. His gaze remained firm, unwavering. "Everyone has to go through security." The air shifted. A few people turned to look. One security officer paused, his steps hesitant. Samantha could feel the sudden attention. She inhaled deeply. A judge. I don't go through security. Foster tilted his head slightly, his lips pressed together into a smile that bordered on arrogant. And I'm a cop. I enforce the rules. A flash of challenge gleamed in his eyes. Samantha's fingers tightened around the handle of her briefcase. She had spent her entire life facing moments like this, knowing when to resist and when to let things slide. But this was not the time to back down. Not today. Not here. Her voice was calm, steady. Are you telling me that all judges have to go through security today, or just me? Foster didn't answer immediately. His jaw clenched, fingers twitching ever so slightly. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not like this. A nearby security officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the procedure, knowing that Samantha had the right to pass without obstruction. But Foster was his superior, and crossing him wasn't easy. Samantha took a step forward. Move. Foster didn't budge. The tension in the air was palpable. The sound of footsteps, the hum of conversations, the rustling of paperwork, all faded into the background, swallowed by the rising storm of silence between them. Foster's hand twitched instinctively at his side, a subtle gesture of power, a habit that had long become second nature. One hand placed on his gun, a shift in stance, or a certain look, they were all signs of authority, of intimidation. But Samantha Hayes wasn't one to be intimidated. She locked eyes with him, unwavering. I suggest you think carefully about your next move. A moment of silence passed, neither of them moving. Then, as if the world had begun to spin again, another officer stepped up. She's cleared, he muttered, his voice unsure. Judges don't go through security. Foster's jaw tightened, his body stiffened, his knuckles went white. But finally he stepped aside. Samantha didn't look back at him. Her back was straight, her head held high. But she could feel it, his fury radiating off him, the burning hatred in his gaze. She had won this round, but she knew men like Foster didn't forget. They didn't let things slide. And the mistake he was about to make would cost him everything. The courthouse was a machine, a relentless force of bureaucracy, law, and order. The hallways echoed with hurried footsteps. Offices were filled with the sound of pencils tearing paper, the clatter of keyboards, the rustle of legal documents. It was an environment built on precision, a system operating on rules, regulations, and protocol. But beneath the glossy marble floors and towering columns that lined the grand hallways, something else was quietly growing. It was subtle, insidious, a truth unspoken but woven into the very fabric of the institution. Discrimination, resentment, power struggles disguised as procedures. And today, one of those battles was about to erupt into something that no one would be able to ignore. Judge Samantha Hayes had always understood the cost of fighting for a place in this world. Nothing was handed to her. Every achievement, every milestone, every step forward was the result of years of sacrifice and an unyielding determination. Raised in the South Side of Chicago, she knew what struggle truly meant in a way that many of her colleagues never could. She had grown up watching her parents fight in a world that wasn't made for them, learning from an early age that justice was a privilege, not a given. As she walked down the corridor toward her office, she took a deep breath to center herself. A long day awaited, cases that needed attention, justice that needed to be served. But what had just happened clung to her, impossible to shake. Behind her, Foster stood still, fists clenched, teeth grinding. He had never felt humiliated like this, never before in front of so many people. He couldn't let this go, not now, not ever. And what he was about to do next would change everything. The courthouse suddenly went quiet, an eerie silence, suffocating, as if the air was being squeezed out of the room, making it difficult to breathe. This wasn't the silence of order, nor was it the respectful quiet of a courtroom awaiting a verdict. No, this was something else. The silence of shock, of fear, of something crumbling too fast for anyone to stop. Judge Samantha Hayes had stood at the center of this courtroom countless times, delivering rulings that changed lives, determining destinies. She had commanded power within these walls, her voice alone enough to impose her will, her presence unshakable. But now, she wasn't behind the bench. She wasn't steady, nor was she making judgments with a steady hand and unwavering gaze. She was on the floor, her body slumped against the marble pillar, breath ragged, struggling for air. The courtroom, once alive with legal debates, the rustling of papers, was now deathly silent. Officer James Foster had lost control. The anger, the resentment, the humiliation that had built up within him had finally erupted, in a moment before the entire courtroom. The jury, the attorneys, the court clerk, and the police. He had lost all restraint. Samantha still felt the shadow of his hands around her neck, the suffocating pressure, the brutality, the desperation. It felt as though his fingers had dug deep into her flesh, relentless, unyielding. He didn't look at her with just rage, but with something deeper, a sense of arrogance, an uncontrollable fury at the audacity of a woman like her to sit in judgment over men like him. The moment came too quickly, but in Samantha's mind, it stretched on endlessly. She had been preparing to leave the bench to return to her office when the case of excessive force was being deliberated by the jury. But before she could take a step, she felt the presence behind her, the air shifting, and then the hands. The attack was swift, brutal, its strength unstoppable. She inhaled sharply, trying to resist, her fingers clawing at his wrists, her body twisting in the grip, but it was all in vain. He had overpowered her, thrusting her violently against the pillar. Pain radiated down her spine. "Do you think you're better than me?" His voice was low, like a sharp blade, trembling with something wild. "You think you can sit there, judging men like me?" The room was too stunned to move. A judge attacked in her own courtroom, by a police officer. It was a moment that shattered every reality, erased every perception, forcing everyone to question everything they thought they knew about order, law, and justice. Samantha tried to speak, trying to force the words past the constriction in her throat, but he tightened his grip. "You people always think you can take from us," he panted, his breath hot, his hands like steel wrapped around her skin. "But not anymore." The world began to tilt, black spots creeping into her vision. She had never felt so powerless. But even in the fiery pain, even as her lungs screamed for air, she locked eyes with him and she saw it, the fear. Foster had lost control. He was gone, and that was why he was doing this. Then, the voice cut through the air like a gunshot. "Officer Foster, let her go." The spell was broken, chaos erupted. Samantha couldn't tell who moved first, whether it was the officer, the deputy, or one of the lawyers, but she knew instantly the pressure on her neck disappeared. The hand that had tightened around her throat was pulled away. She collapsed, her knees losing all strength, her vision fading as she fell to the cold floor, coughing violently, gasping for air. People started shouting. The once quiet courtroom erupted into a storm, lawyers rushing forward, the jury recoiling in panic, the clerk hastily grabbing a phone, some calling for backup, others just recording the chaos. Foster resisted still. She heard the struggle before her vision cleared, the sound of scuffling shoes, grunted groans, the sharp commands of the officers trying to subdue him. "Get down! Let go! Stop resisting!" Samantha forced herself to stand, despite the searing pain in her throat, despite the dizziness threatening to pull her back down. She blinked quickly, clearing her vision, and saw him being restrained, his face pressed to the cold floor, his arms twisted behind him, handcuffs clicking around his wrists. The man who had spent his life enforcing the law was now being subdued, dragged away in humiliation. She wiped her mouth, the metallic taste of blood still lingering, then stepped forward. Her voice was hoarse but resolute. "Get him out of my courtroom." The words landed like a final judgment. Foster paused, no longer resisting. For the first time, he truly looked at her. And in that moment, she saw his gaze shift. Recognition, fear, understanding of what he had just done. He had thrown it all away. His career, his power, his life as he knew it. All because he couldn't bear to see a black woman in a position of authority over him. The officers pulled him up, gripping his arms tightly as they escorted him out of the courtroom. The entire room watched, some still too stunned to react, others murmuring quietly, trying to make sense of the catastrophe that had just unfolded. At the door, Foster turned back, trying one last time to regain something, however small. His voice was gravelly, full of curses and the remnants of self-righteousness. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You think we'll let you rise above us?" Samantha did not step back. She stood firm, unshaken, meeting his gaze with all the power she possessed. "You've already lost." The door slammed shut behind him, and once again, silence enveloped the room. But this silence was not the suffocating, fearful quiet from before. This was different. This was a silence of decision. She exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders back, reclaiming the composure she had honed over a lifetime. Then she turned to face those still stunned before her, the attorneys, the clerk, the jury. All of them had just witnessed the unthinkable. "The jury will continue deliberating," she said, her voice calm, unwavering. "The trial is concluded." And with that she walked away. But the world would not forget what had just occurred, and what was to come would shake the very foundation of the country. The small, suffocating cell. A space where time seemed to stop, where the air was stagnant, and the walls closed in like a slow, merciless vice. Flickering fluorescent lights cast a sickly blue glow across the man sitting on the metal bench, still shackled. His uniform was wrinkled, stained with the sweat of defeat. James Foster sat with his head hung low, shoulders slumped, his breath heavy. He had barely spoken since being dragged from the courtroom, since that door had slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate. In his mind, everything kept repeating. The panic, the weight of the officers bearing down on him, the biting cold of the handcuffs locking around his wrists. He had been on the other side of this room countless times, but never like this. Never as the one in cuffs. The sound of footsteps echoed before he saw her. Slowly, the click of stiletto heels tapping on the linoleum floor, deliberate and almost torturous. He didn't look up immediately, not wanting to. But he knew who it was. He could feel it. Samantha Hayes. Stopped just in front of the bars. Her presence sliced through the thick atmosphere like a razor-sharp blade. She stood tall, unyielding, despite the bruises on her neck, the imprint of his hands still marked on her skin. Her throat burned from the chokehold, but her voice didn't tremble as she spoke. "Unlock his cuffs." The guard hesitated, his eyes shifting between them, uncertain. But Samantha didn't repeat the command. She didn't need to. Seconds later, the sharp click of the handcuffs unlocking filled the small room. Foster let out a heavy breath as his wrists were freed. His hands fell limply to his thighs, but he didn't move. He didn't stretch them out, didn't try to ease the ache. He didn't react to the freedom that had just been granted to him. She stepped closer, hands clasped in front of her, her gaze as cold and unreadable as a blade. "You really think you can get away with this?" Her voice was calm, almost unnervingly so. "You think no one's going to stop you? You think you can lay hands on me, right in my courtroom, in front of dozens of witnesses, and just walk away without consequence?" Foster inhaled sharply through his nose, but still, he didn't look at her. His jaw was clenched tight, his muscles taut with frustration. "Is it worth it?" She tilted her head slightly, her eyes studying him like a specimen under glass. "Is it worth losing everything? Your badge, your career, your reputation? Is it worth becoming the man the whole country will soon see brought down?" His fingers clenched into fists on his knees. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice rough, weighted with something unspoken. "Then explain," she challenged, her arms crossed over her chest. "Help me understand, Officer Foster." His head jerked up. His cold, sharp eyes finally locked with hers. But for the first time, there was no power there. No control. "You don't belong there," he said, his voice low, sharp like a knife. "You sit in that chair, wear that robe, make decisions that change lives, and none of it belongs to you." Samantha inhaled deeply, letting those words sink into her mind, letting herself feel the familiar sting of them. The poison she had spent her life learning to face. "You say I don't belong," she corrected, her voice unwavering. "Is it because I'm a black woman?" Foster snorted, shaking his head, but in his silence, there was no denial. Samantha took a step closer, closing the gap between them just enough for him to see the certainty in her eyes. A strength so firm, so unshakable, the very thing he had spent his life trying to erase. You think that if you lay a hand on me, if you humiliate me, if you make me feel small, you can erase everything? She asked, her tone almost sympathetic. You think you can remind me of my place? His nostrils flared, but he remained silent. But there's one thing, she continued, leaning slightly forward, her voice dropping low enough to make him hold his breath. I don't have a fixed position. I create my own position. And no matter how many people like you show up, no matter how many try to break me, I'll still be here. I'll still stand firm. Foster inhaled sharply, shaking his head again, but this time there was a void in the movement. You think this changes anything? His voice was bitter, thick with resentment. You think they'll actually let you keep that seat? They'll find a way to kick you out? They always do. Samantha didn't blink. Then just wait and see, she replied curtly. He let out a dry, humorless laugh, then placed his hand over his face, as though trying to soothe some invisible pain. His whole body sagged with exhaustion. And now what? He muttered. You'll be prosecuted, she said coldly, without emotion. Aggravated assault. Attempted murder. Attacking a judge. Your trial will be public, with cameras rolling, and you'll become an example to warn every officer who thinks they can stand above the law. His fingers twitched slightly. You think that makes it even? He whispered, as if the words were meant only for him. Samantha raised an eyebrow. Even? You think that just because I'm about to fall, you've won? His voice was sharp, laced with despair. You think this is justice? She exhaled, shaking her head. Justice? Justice should have been that you never thought you had the right to touch me in the first place. Justice should have been that you were punished the first time you laid a hand on someone weaker. Justice should have been a system that never let people like you think they were untouchable. His chest rose and fell violently. His hands were clenched so tightly on his knees that the joints were turning white. Samantha took a step back, watching him closely, letting the silence stretch between them. You're nothing special, James, she said finally. You're just the first they've decided to stop protecting. His eyes flickered, something unreadable passing over his face. The door creaked open. A guard stepped in, clearing his throat. It's time. Samantha nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on Foster. Then, without saying another word, she turned and walked out of the room. Her shoulders were squared, her steps steady. She didn't look back. But Foster did. He watched her retreating figure disappear behind the door, saw it. Close. And in that moment he felt it fully, the thing he had never known in his life. The sensation of helplessness. The news spread like wildfire before Samantha Hayes even left the courthouse. The images of the attack flooded every screen, every newspaper, every radio station. Social media exploded, news programs debated fiercely. The footage from the courtroom became an instant phenomenon, replayed across every channel. A police officer attacking a judge right in her own courtroom. A sight that defied all belief in order and justice. The entire nation watched as Foster's hand tightened around Samantha's throat, saw him throw her down, watched as the packed room went silent in collective shock. They saw her struggle, watched her gasp for air, saw her body collapse when he was finally pulled away. Then they watched the moment his entire world crumbled, when he was slammed to the floor, when the cuffs clicked tightly around his wrists, when the power he had always held so easily was stripped away in front of everyone. The nation was watching. The world was watching. Inside the courthouse, Samantha sat still in her office, surrounded by a cacophony of voices. Advisors, legal teams, government officials, all speaking. Words piling on top of one another, concerns stacking up. Some asked if she needed increased security. Others wanted to know when she would make a public statement. Some suggested adding more charges against Foster. Others warned her to control the narrative, to be cautious of how public opinion might shift. She listened but said little. Her mind was somewhere else, replaying every moment that led to this point. Because this had never been just about James Foster. It was about every judge, every official, every person of color who had been told they didn't belong in the positions of power they were more than deserving of. It was about the countless cases that had passed through her hands, stories of abuse of power, of people crushed by the very system that was supposed to protect them. It was about every time justice had been denied, about how people like Foster had so often escaped punishment, unscathed. The difference now was that this time, there would be no brushing it off as if nothing had happened. Foster was in a cell now, without a badge, without a gun, without power. The police department severed ties with him quickly. Official statement was released immediately. They called his actions a disgrace, condemned him, and pledged he would face the full legal consequences. A calculated move to create distance before the fire spread too far. Samantha knew how this game worked. She had witnessed this scenario far too many times. They would make him a scapegoat, act as if it were an isolated incident, a momentary lapse in judgment, an unfortunate exception rather than acknowledging it as a symptom of a deep-rooted problem. They would present him as evidence that the system still functioned, that justice had been served, that no one was above the law. They would remove him from the ranks, disown him, pretend his fall had a deeper significance. But Samantha knew the truth. This wasn't justice. It was damage control. And the backlash had already begun. Her inbox was flooded with emails. Her phone buzzed constantly. Some messages were filled with support, admiration, gratitude. But others were dripping with venom, threats, accusations, rage. The media turned everything into a spectacle, a national debate. People demanded answers. Wanted to know what would happen next. Insisted on taking sides. And then there were those who quickly rushed to support Foster. Those who called it an overreaction, saying he had simply lost his temper, that it wasn't that serious, that he had been provoked, that she should have backed down, that his career wasn't worth being ruined over one moment. Samantha had seen this too many times. A black person can be killed right in front of a camera, and they'll dissect every frame to find reasons to justify it. But a white cop can attack a judge in a courtroom full of witnesses, and there will still be people trying to excuse him. You should leave the city for a while, her assistant's voice dropped, cautious. Just until things cool down. Samantha shook her head. If I run, what does that say? Her assistant hesitated. That you value your safety. Samantha exhaled, fingers pressing lightly against her temples. Her throat still ached. On her skin, the faint imprint of Foster's hand had yet to fade. But the deeper wound was the realization that if he killed her, they would still find a way to justify it. She stood, her gaze drifting toward the window frame. Out there, the city continued to move. Reporters had gathered, cameras flashing, microphones held out. As if waiting for her to step forward and explain what everyone had already painfully witnessed. This won't blow over, her assistant murmured. She turned back, her expression unreadable. It never has. A soft knock echoed, urgent but brief. Another assistant peeked in. The governor's on the line, his voice lowered. Wants to speak to you directly. Samantha sighed, straightening her back. She had known how this conversation would go. Support would be offered, assurances that the state was taking the matter seriously, a carefully crafted statement already prepared by his media team. But behind all of that, she knew what he really wanted to ask. How bad will this get? Still, she picked up the phone. In the holding cell, James Foster sat still, his back pressed against the cold wall, hands resting loosely on his thighs. The sounds of the day still echoed in his head, the shouts, the commands, the gasps of terror in the courtroom. His mind kept rewinding to the moment everything came crashing down. He had never been on this side of the story. He had never been the one in cuffs. He had never been the one sitting in a cell, waiting for someone else to decide his fate. His lawyer had come, speaking quickly, saying they were planning a defense, that they would argue he lost control temporarily, that work stress had pushed him to the brink, that they would try to get a lighter sentence. Foster barely heard any of it, because deep inside he knew there was no turning back. No reinstatement. No chance for redemption. No easy ending where he was simply given a slap on the wrist and continued as if nothing ever happened. His whole life, he had believed that people like him were untouchable. And in a single moment, He had proven the opposite. That awareness weighed heavily on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He tilted his head back, closed his eyes, and exhaled slowly. For the first time in his life, James Foster understood what it meant to lose control. And for the first time in her life, Samantha Hayes understood what it meant to win. Not because the system worked the way it should, but because this time it had failed him. The cell felt smaller now. The air thick, suffocating, as if the walls were slowly closing in with every passing second. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh, unforgiving glow, exposing everything. The creases in his rumpled uniform, the dried sweat on his temples, the exhaustion etched into Foster's face. He had stopped checking the clock. Time no longer mattered. His life had been measured by power, by control, by always knowing exactly where he stood. But here, in this cage, only uncertainty remained. The prison door creaked open. The sound of the hinges echoed sharply, reverberating off the cold concrete floor. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. The steady click of high heels on the floor, slow, deliberate, purposeful. Samantha Hayes stood just beyond the bars, motionless, her gaze fixed on him. He could feel her presence before he forced himself to raise his eyes. Her stance was firm, unyielding, despite the bruises still visible on her neck, the marks of his hands, undeniable proof of what he had done. The silence stretched out, heavy with everything that had happened, with the history, the resentment, and the bitter intersection of their two worlds. Finally, Samantha spoke. Once said they would never let me keep that seat. Her voice was calm, cold. And yet, here I am. Foster inhaled deeply, his fingers twitching slightly against his thigh. But he said nothing. Samantha didn't look away. You think you're invincible. She folded her arms across her chest. You think the rules don't apply to you, that no matter what you do, you'll get away with it. Isn't that right, Foster? His jaw clenched, his eyes lowering briefly before reluctantly lifting to meet hers. Do you think this is justice? His voice was hoarse, strange, tinged with bitterness, a hint of desperation. You think locking me up makes you better than me? Samantha tilted her head slightly. I don't need to be better than you, she replied simply. I just need you to lose. His breath quickened, his shoulders stiffened, his fists clenching until his knuckles turned white. You think you've won? A mocking smile flickered across her lips, but there was no warmth in it. Really? He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Look at what's happening out there. The press, the protests, the threats. They're demanding my head. My name is ruined. My family. He paused his hands, cradling his temples as he took a deep breath. You don't understand this, do you? Samantha watched him quietly. No, she said. He suddenly lifted his head, his gaze full of frustration. You don't understand what it's like to lose everything in an instant. She scoffed, shaking her head. Lose everything? You're still breathing, aren't you? You still have a roof over your head. You wake up every morning and go on living. You're still alive, Foster. You want to talk about losing everything? How many people have stood where you're standing now because of you? How many lives have you ruined with your decisions, knowing full well you'd never pay the price? His jaw clenched, his breath more ragged, uneven. I was doing my job. You abused your power. His hand tightened into a fist, gripping his knee. His body was tense, his muscles coiled. I was keeping order. Samantha's eyes darkened, her voice softening. Order for who? He swallowed, staring at her as if trying to explain, but the words wouldn't come. You don't get it, he whispered. The world's different now. People like you, sitting in positions of power, making the rules, calling the shots, while people like us are just expected to accept it. Samantha took a deep breath, calming herself. That's exactly what you wanted us to do, isn't it? Accept it. Accept you beating people into submission. Accept being stopped, harassed, threatened, choked, thrown to the ground as if we were nothing. You spent your life demanding respect, but when it came time to give it, you refused. And now, you have nothing left to demand. Foster's breath hitched, but he let out a bitter laugh. You think you're better than me? She didn't blink. No, Foster. I think I'm nothing like you. The words landed like a slap to the face, striking him hard. His whole body stiffened, his shoulders hunched, his hands shaking as if he wanted to resist, to argue, to throw something at her to shake her confidence. But he had nothing. He had nothing left. Samantha stood still, watching him, her gaze unflinching. His expression shifted, his defiance breaking, the arrogance crumbling under the weight of reality. She had seen men like him her entire life, men who had believed for so long that they were untouchable, never stopping to think about what would happen when they lost it all. And now he was drowning in that very truth. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. What happens to me now? Samantha sighed, tilting her head slightly. What do you think happens, Foster? He inhaled deeply, swallowing hard. Prison. Samantha nodded. Yes. He swallowed again, struggling. How long? Long enough, she replied. The silence stretched out, growing heavier. He wiped his face with his hand, fingers digging into his scalp, his breath uneven. I don't know who I am without that badge. Samantha stared at him for a long moment before finally speaking. I guess you'll have plenty of time to figure that out. Her words fell into the air like an irreversible judgment. For the first time, Foster had nothing to say. She turned and walked toward the door. She didn't look back, but Foster watched, his eyes following her as she left, watching the door close behind her. In that moment, everything seemed to crash down on him. For the first time in his life, he felt the price of it all. James Foster had lost control, and for the first time ever, Samantha Hayes had made a man like him understand that feeling. The walls of the cell now felt as though they were closing in, the silence thickening, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. He sank into the metal chair, elbows resting on his knees, hands hanging limply between them. His uniform was wrinkled, his cuffs and weapon gone, stripped away along with the illusion of power that once made him feel untouchable. Time here passed in a different way, endless, each second dragging on. He had stopped trying to guess how long it had been, how many hours had blurred together. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered. The cell door creaked open again, the sound slicing through. The silence like a knife. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, each step echoing on the concrete. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Samantha Hayes stood just beyond the bars, her posture straight, the solid presence of her a stark contrast to his own. The bruises around her neck had darkened, the deep purple marks on her skin a permanent reminder of what had happened, of what he had done. Evidence that no words could ever erase. There was a long silence before Samantha spoke. Foster exhaled through his nose, dragging his hand down his face. You came back. His voice was hoarse, drained from the long hours of silence. Samantha didn't blink. Did you think I wouldn't? His fingers trembled slightly on his knee, his body stiffening. I don't know what to think anymore. Samantha tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. Good. He sighed, a dry smile flickering across his lips, but there was no warmth in it. You must enjoy this, huh? Samantha's expression remained neutral. No, Foster. I don't enjoy it. His jaw tightened. Then why are you here? She stepped closer, standing by the bars, arms crossed over her chest. Because. I want to know if you get it. He furrowed his brow, confusion momentarily flashing in his tired eyes. Get what? Samantha took a deep breath, locking eyes with him. The feeling of helplessness. Foster let out a short laugh and shook his head. I don't, Samantha cut him off, her voice sharp. Yes, you do. For the first time in your life, you're sitting on the other side of a system you always thought you could control. And now you just sit here, waiting to see who gets to decide your future, waiting to see if there's any way out, waiting for a verdict you can't change. Tell me, is that fair? His breath quickened, his fingers clenched tight on his knee. This isn't. Samantha raised an eyebrow, her gaze unyielding. Not what? He exhaled sharply, his hand clenching into a fist. I was wrong. She fell silent for a moment, her voice as cold as steel. Wrong? Foster, forgetting to pay for parking is a mistake. Forgetting someone's name is a mistake. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You used your hands to hurt me in a room full of people because you thought you had the right to. You thought no one would stop you. You thought you could get away with it, like you always have before. His jaw clenched, his breath ragged and uneven. I didn't, Samantha interrupted him, moving closer, her presence looming over him even though she was still behind the bars. You thought you could do whatever you wanted without consequences. You thought that badge made you invincible. You thought your uniform made no one dare challenge you. And now look at you. You're here. Your name plastered all over the papers. The people who used to protect you won't even answer your calls. Finally, you get it, don't you? He remained silent, his jaw working, breath stuck in his chest, but he didn't speak. Samantha stared at him for a long time, her eyes never leaving his. You're not special, Foster. You never were. You just had the privilege of believing you were. His shoulders stiffened, his body frozen. You think you're better than me? Samantha exhaled slowly, unhurried. No, Foster. I think I survived you. A dark flicker flashed in his eyes. The last traces of resistance disappeared, replaced by something else, something empty, dangerous, and almost self-aware. You spent years believing that badge gave you the right to control the lives of people like me, Samantha said, her voice softer but still powerful. And now, for the first time, you're the one sitting in the cage. How does it feel? Foster sighed, pressing his hand to his temple. You thought you were different, Samantha continued. You thought you'd always be protected. But the truth is, the moment you became a burden, they discarded you like you were nothing. His body stiffened, fingers digging into his knees. Samantha looked at him intently. I watched them do it, she said. I saw them cut all ties with you the moment you became a threat. And now, you're just another story, another headline, a man who thought he was untouchable until he wasn't. Foster swallowed hard, his breath quickening. You don't understand, he muttered. Then explain it to me, Samantha challenged, her voice sharp. Foster's hands trembled as he spoke, his voice barely audible. I don't know who I am without that badge. Samantha exhaled, tilting her head. Then you've got a lifetime to figure it out. Silence hung between them, heavier than ever before. Foster's hands clenched, his breath becoming strange, unstable. He whispered, What happens now? Samantha stared at him for a long moment before answering, What happens to you? What happens to those who enter this system? You disappear. Her words hit like a sledgehammer. Foster's face drained of color, his body slumping as the last fight drained from him. Samantha said no more. She turned and walked away, her footsteps steady on the floor, each step a final, irreversible decision. Foster watched her go, gasping for breath, his hands trembling. When the heavy steel door slammed shut behind her, he finally understood what it felt like to be forgotten. The trial was unforgiving. Every detail of James Foster's actions was laid bare, dissected under the unflinching gaze of the justice system, a system that no longer saw him as a protector, but as a criminal. Irrefutable evidence, damning courtroom footage, brutal testimonies. There was no chance for redemption, no last-minute savior, no legal loophole to erase what he had done. The system that once shielded him had cast him aside without hesitation, as easily as they had once forgiven his actions. Foster sat in silence as the judge delivered the sentence, guilty on all counts, intentional assault, obstruction of justice, unlawful use of force, abuse of office. The charges piled on like bricks in a wall he could not escape. The sentence was even harsher than expected, 20 years with no chance for parole for the first 15. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension, phones and cameras flashing nonstop. His lawyer spoke on his behalf, but the words were hollow, meaningless. The story had already been written. The guards escorted him out. Foster felt no trace of the power he once held. His head was high, not in defiance, but because there was nothing left to fight for. There was no one left to fight for him. The first night in prison was the hardest. The bed was stiff, the air heavy, the silence almost taunting. They called his name with disdain, not protection, their gazes filled with judgment. This was the place he had sent so many before. He could feel the looks from the inmates, from the guards, those who no longer spared him a second glance. He had always thought fear was something he inflicted on others, but never once did he imagine that he would feel it when it came back to haunt him. As for Samantha Hayes, she had never been stronger. The assault had failed to break her. She had etched her name into history, overcoming everything, and now she shone in ways no one had ever anticipated. The name Samantha Hayes was no longer confined to the legal system, it echoed across the country. She had become a symbol, not just of unwavering strength, but of justice prevailing in a system that had long resisted accountability for people like Foster. When she returned to the courtroom, that in itself was a statement. She was not cast out, nor was she defeated. As she walked through the corridors, the weight of what had transpired lingered, but there was something else present. Respect, admiration, even from those who had once doubted her. Her judgments now carried a different kind of weight. Every decision she made was scrutinized, dissected, analyzed by those who watched, waiting for a mistake. But she never wavered. Her entire career had been dedicated to fighting for the right to sit in that seat, and now nothing could take that from her. The threats kept coming, letters, emails, online harassment, but none of it mattered anymore. She had faced the worst of it, and she stood firm. As time passed, Foster gradually faded from the headlines. He became just another prisoner, a failed officer, a cautionary tale whispered in law enforcement circles. His name was no longer uttered with respect, no longer a source of fear, no longer admired. He was merely a man in a prison uniform, forgotten by the very system he had once wielded as a weapon. Meanwhile, Samantha continued to shine. When the opportunity arose, she immediately accepted the nomination for a position on the appellate court, without hesitation. Her name became one frequently cited by legal scholars, her decisions referenced in landmark cases. Whispers of her potential nomination to the Supreme Court began quietly, only to gradually grow louder. She never needed permission to become powerful. She had always been that way, always knowing where she belonged. If you were in Samantha's shoes, how would you navigate the relentless pressure and scrutiny? Have you ever had to fight for what's right, knowing the cost? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice could inspire change and encourage others to stand firm in their convictions. If this story resonated with you, don't hesitate to share it with friends and family. Let's spread the message of resilience and justice together. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.